What does it mean to speak your mind in our democracy? How do we really make our voices heard? Well, we can speak out.
Mr. Governor!
From the streets of our cities, the halls of local governments, we stand behind candidates who share our worldview, trusting them to act in our best interest. And then there's something else, something very direct. The ability of any normal citizen to pursue an idea for change, maybe correcting a perceived injustice, maybe finding a new freedom. And if this citizen can convince enough other citizens it's a good idea, the idea can become law. A law directly from the people.
Covering the Constitutional Convention for AP was really my first major job after getting out of college.
Journalist Chuck Johnson has been reporting on Montana politics for more than 40 years.
10 attorneys.
6 governors, 18 sessions of the Montana legislature. He gets it. He's been here, writing about it all, from the 70s to Schweitzer. After all of it, Johnson still calls his first job the assignment of a lifetime.
How often does a state rewrite its constitution? Twice in our history, and I was there for one of them.
Montana citizens came to the state capitol well aware of the issues and determined to write a new constitution.
The 72 Constitution made a huge change in ballot measures because for the first time it allowed members of the public to propose constitutional amendments, not just the legislature.
By gathering so many signatures, Montana citizens themselves can place constitutional amendments on the ballot.
But a constitutional convention 40 years ago certainly was not the beginning of Montana's foray into the ballot measure process. In the early 1900s, a progressive movement spread around the country, one of the pillars of which was to give people the ability to pass law through initiative.
And Montana voters adopted that by 85% of the vote in 1906.
And modern day. In 2012, we are still using that right. The citizens of Montana have put 2 measures on the November ballot. Then we have the legislative referendum. These come from the state legislature asking for a public vote. So for the remainder of this program, we're going to be looking at all of these ballot measures, examining the arguments for and against them. Stick around.
As Chuck Johnson said earlier, in 1906, Montanans earned the right to create law through initiative.
And in 1912, one of the very first initiatives that Montana voters passed was the Corrupt Practices Act.
Before 1912,
you have all kinds of corrupt things going on in Montana government. The first dozen years of Montana statehood are probably the worst.
the legendary battle of Copper Kings Marcus Daly and William A. Clark.
Essentially just buying votes, buying legislators.
Coming to a climax with Clark buying a seat in the U.S. Senate. Voters were fed up and used their new power of initiative, drafting a bill banning corporations from direct spending in elections. It passed with nearly 80% of the vote.
It wasn't that controversial because it was so obvious that this needed to take place.
The Corrupt Practices Act, passed in 1912, remained on the books for 100 years.
That was the centerpiece of the case before the U.S. Supreme Court earlier this year.
The case, American Tradition Partnership versus Montana Attorney General Steve Bullock. The justices struck down the Corrupt Practices Act.
Court said that ban flew in the face of the Citizens United decision they had a couple of years ago.
Citizens United versus FCC has become one of the most controversial Supreme Court decisions of the last decade. The ruling allows corporations or unions to spend unlimited amounts of money on advertisements directly in favor of or against political candidates.
We've had a fair system of elections. We've benefited from that. Now the Supreme Court is saying, no, you have to have corruption.
Initiative 166 comes as a response to Citizens United and the striking down of the Corrupt Practices Act.
And it will put Montanans on record for what sort of election procedures they want to establish.
Ballot language reads, I-166 establishes a state policy that corporations are not entitled to constitutional rights because they are not human beings, and charges Montana elected officials, state and federal, to implement that policy. Broad-sounding at first, the full ballot language focuses more directly on corporate campaign spending. The group Stand With Montanans drafted the ballot language.
Educating voters about.
C.B. Pearson is working as the campaign treasurer. He says large multinational businesses should not be able to spend at will from their corporate treasuries to influence elections.
That means just as they buy cars or nails, they just want to buy politics for an end result, and that end result is profit.
This is our government, and we're not going to allow any corporation to steal it from us.
Stand With Montanans began collecting signatures for I-166 in May. The first names on that list, Democratic Governor Brian Schweitzer, Republican Lieutenant Governor John Bollinger, and a man out of the state political limelight for some time now, former Republican Secretary of State Werner Bertelsen.
I've lived here 94 years and I never saw a corporation I wanted to dance with yet.
You heard that age right.
Just 94.
Bertelsen came out of a nearly decade-long retirement to take the Secretary of State post back in 1988. Today, he's still an active guy. Up at 6, bite to eat.
7 grain.
Then walking the mall.
Because I'm very interested in keeping my health.
You can often find Bertelsen chatting politics in a local cafe. But at this point, he only steps into the public eye for issues he finds of utmost importance. He says Citizens United creates a far greater potential for corruption than the conditions leading to the Corrupt Practices Act in 1912.
This becomes a tremendously big national issue, not only in Montana, but all the states of the Union.
Bertelsen says a movement to reverse Citizens United could start in a rural place. This tiny flame of change could spread across the West, across the country, to the halls of Congress.
The end point is a constitutional amendment.
It's a dream that has its detractors.
This is going to happen when pigs fly.
That's Republican State Senator Dave Lewis, and that's what he wrote in the local opinion pages, which Bertelsen reads religiously.
You kind of derogatory statements, yeah, when pigs fly, this will happen and all that sort of thing.
So he wrote back.
Is Senator Lewis saying that corporations are people and should have the same rights as people?
Not necessarily. More than anything, though, Lewis just thinks I-166 is ridiculous.
This is ridiculous. If the people of Montana vote for this, nothing is going to happen.
The directives in I-166 to Montana's elected officials are by their very nature non-binding. Anything the state would do to limit corporate campaign spending would be unconstitutional. And Lewis points out, in order to pass a constitutional amendment,
it takes 2/3 of the members of Congress and 3/4 of the states to approve it, and I do not see that as even possible. It seems like such a waste of time and effort to put it on the ballot and ask the people to vote for it.
And then there are the people who actively oppose I-166 because they want Citizens United in place. Gary Marbett likes to get out on the range.
Some people collect stamps, and some people refurbish hot rods, and I like to shoot.
A lot. He's the president of the Montana Shooting Sports Association. It's a nonprofit corporation that pursues and promotes pro-gun policies. And Marbett says Citizens United gives his organization the opportunity to be a political player in a way it has never been.
We're not Exxon, we're not Citibank, we're a nonprofit corporation of like-minded individuals joined together in a common purpose.
He says, why shouldn't a group like his be able to spend money to try and affect policy? That's why the association exists, why the members pay dues.
Voted 97% with Obama.
And yeah, it may lead to more misleading ads. He says that's freedom of speech.
I think the people of Montana are smarter than to go with a candidate just because somebody spends a lot of money on his campaign.
Montanans will need to decide how we view freedom of speech. Should a corporation be seen as a group of individuals speaking together, even if they are speaking through the corporate treasury, even if they are speaking from beyond the border of our state or of our nation? Or should Montanans vote to censor this type of speech to lower the risk of corruption, even if the vote flies in the face of the highest court in the land, even if the vote is really nothing more than a symbol? How do measures really make it to the ballot in Montana? Oh, it's no small task.
So a sponsor starts with an idea, they send it to our office, and we send it off to Legislative Services for a language review.
They usually need work to meet the technical requirements.
Yes, almost without exception.
Then it goes to the Attorney General for a legal review.
Some never make it past here. If the AG's office determines the measure legally insufficient, it's sent back to the sponsor to fix before deadline. That's how one measure was knocked out this year.
And if that is then accepted and affirmed, then it goes through the signature gathering process.
An initiative, the people creating a new law or modifying an existing law. It requires the signatures of 5% of voters, and that includes 5% in each of at least 1/3 of state house districts. That's 34 tabs.
I'm not doing that.
Anyway, it ends up being about 25,000 signatures. Same number for an initiative referendum.
An initiative referendum, or IR, puts a law that's currently on the books up for voter approval.
Thanks, Monet. And then we have the constitutional initiative,
which changes the Montana Constitution.
You need twice as many signatures for that,
with 10% in each of at least 2/5 of all the House districts.
So say the sponsors do it. They show up and say, hey, look, I've got 25,000 signatures right here.
Yeah, that's still not enough. Election officials have to verify every single signature.
Lewis and Clark County Election Supervisor Marilyn Bracken says most Montanans don't realize how much work that is.
I don't think they have a clue.
Everyone.
It's very thorough.
Reading the name.
It has to be thorough.
Checking it against the database.
Sometimes you have to put illegible because you can't read it.
The person may be registering to vote at the same time, or not.
He is not registered.
So he's out. This happens across the state, checking thousands and thousands of names for all the measures that do not make it, as well as for those that do.
Can you go ahead and give me the old first, last name, and credentials?
Mike Milburn, Speaker of the House. I was for the full repeal. That was what I was hearing out there, that Montanans got duped on what the purpose of the first initiative was for medical marijuana.
It was never about regulating marijuana as an industry, but here we are trying to close the floodgates on a dam that was never built.
Medical marijuana, arguably the most intensely debated issue of the 2011 legislature. Impassioned public pleas.
As a retired addiction professional, I'm very concerned about what's going on in our school areas.
To bitterly divided lawmakers. A citizen initiative had legalized the medical use of cannabis 7 years earlier, passed by more than a 60% majority. A law allowing the production, possession, and use of marijuana for those with debilitating medical conditions, like cancer or glaucoma. It was vaguely written. As the legislature convened in January of last year, 20,000 Montanans held the so-called green cards allowing marijuana use.
What we've seen over the last year is not what those of us who wrote the law and promoted it ever imagined or envisioned.
Clinics were being held, registering hundreds of patients at a time, often to large groups of young people, listing chronic pain as their debilitating condition. Marijuana storefronts were operating in towns and cities across the state, employing an estimated 1,400 people.
This law was about compassion. We were sold on it. Dispensaries have nothing to do with compassion.
Republican Speaker Milburn's full repeal of the medical marijuana law passed Republican majorities in both the House and Senate.
Oh, what the hell? We'll give it a bull brand. Yeah!
Before winding up on the long list of bills facing Democratic Governor Brian Schweitzer's veto branding iron. There was still wide consensus among lawmakers that some changes to marijuana regulations needed to be made. Billings Republican State Senator Jeff Essman brought forward a reform bill, which passed the legislature and the governor's office. Senate Bill 423.
Was this as close to repeal
as you could get.
I think it was.
The reform puts an end to the industry and significantly restricts who qualifies for marijuana and how they can access it. Registered card holders fell from a high of 30,000 in May of 2011 to about 8,000.
Still, that number is very high. Those people, they're not medical marijuana users. They're recreational marijuana users, and we still have to get that under control.
They took away the votes of the Montana voters in 2004. I have epilepsy and I use it to control my seizures.
Helena resident Sarah Combs is still a registered patient through SB 423. She says she absolutely is a medical marijuana user.
I don't think it was being abused as badly as they thought. I think it was being flaunted, and I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that's hurt folks that legitimately need it.
The marijuana community quickly gathered the required signatures to put SB 423 up to a vote of the people as Initiative Referendum 124. Combs calls the reform absurd.
A patient can't legally get seeds and they can't legally get clones. How are they supposed to start legally growing for themselves?
Well, we have to remember that it's really not legal to grow. We have said in the state, from a state standpoint, that you can do it, but we can't circumvent the federal government's laws.
In the spring of 2011, as lawmakers were debating the various reform bills, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration raided marijuana facilities around the state.
There was money laundering. We were considered a source nation for export of marijuana. We had organized crime in Montana. We had it distributing by a gang. It was big, big business.
Agents destroyed inventory, arrested growers, all in apparent reversal from a 2009 Obama administration memo labeling medical marijuana a low priority for federal agents. Sarah Combs acknowledges the chilling effect of the federal raids. She says the state would never go back to the way things were, even if the reform was repealed. But she says it's the old law that allows her to consistently obtain the strains that help her the most, grown by professionals.
It doesn't have to be 50 million little tiny stores with green doors. It doesn't have to be like that. It's part of the culture, and I don't begrudge that, but to me it's not a culture. To me it's a medication, and I need to have access to it safely.
The two sides to IR 124 are stark.
We cannot go another year with this law.
We can't afford to go back to where we were.
Perhaps the most important thing for voters to remember, a vote for IR 124 upholds Senate Bill 423. It keeps the reform in place. A vote against IR 124 reverts the state back to the old medical marijuana law passed in 2004. Okay, so after the ballot measures have all gone through the legal review, the signatures have all been gathered and counted, the ballot is set, what happens then?
Then our office takes all the information, we compile everything into one handy little booklet.
Oh yes, the voter information pamphlet. Thank you, Jared. If you're a registered voter, your household will be getting one of these in the mail. The Secretary of State's office provides them to help people brush up on the ballot measures. The process starts well in advance. Sponsors and state elected leaders appoint committees to write pro and con arguments for each measure. These committees then get to write rebuttals to each other's arguments. The Secretary of State's office gathers all these arguments and plugs them in straight across.
Basically what I'm doing is copying and pasting word for word what the committees have sent us. We don't make any changes.
They are printed up and shipped off. This year, the state is spending nearly $50,000 printing 450,000 of these pamphlets. State statute calls for it, and the Secretary of State's office stands behind it.
And it's the most non-biased article you can find.
Wouldn't hurt to flip through it once or twice.
Summer gardening gives Republican State Senator Dave Lewis a much appreciated outlet, using a method he learned working for a farmer when he was a teenager.
He always said that flood irrigating was about as close to God as you can get.
It takes dedication,
they're nice healthy trees,
optimism,
This will be a
a miracle. A ripe watermelon here.
And a willingness to adapt at any time to produce a greater yield. It's not too unlike the state legislature.
That one, I had to think about it a little bit, but it's a dumb idea.
During the 2011 legislature, Democratic Governor Brian Schweitzer set a state record for vetoes.
It's going to get a calf brand.
78 bills withered beneath that red-hot branding iron. It led the Republican-dominated House and Senate to put a few bills on a different path.
You sit there and you go, we believe in these measures. There's no chance they're going to get past the governor. We're going to do an end around.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, none of those would have been acceptable to the governor, and so when you have a majority in the legislature, you have the ability to put issues on the ballot.
This is the process of legislative referendum, allowing lawmakers to bypass the executive branch with a simple majority if they think they have a better chance with the people. Speaker Milburn says Republican lawmakers prioritized 5 specific measures to become legislative referenda. He calls them comparatively simple, easy to understand, largely values-based. The Montana Supreme Court tossed out 2, leaving 3 for the ballot. LR 120. It would require parental notification prior to abortion for a minor.
You can't give an aspirin in school without calling up the parent and saying, can we give your child an aspirin? You can't go get your ears pierced, a minor, without calling up the parents, but yet you can go get an abortion.
Executive director of the nonprofit NARAL Pro-Choice Montana, Juliana Crowley, says the parent is still being told, and that can be precisely the problem.
Not all young people come from healthy families, and it's not the government's role to mandate healthy family communication where it does not exist.
Crowley says the vast majority of young girls do consult with their parents before considering abortion. Those that do not, she says, may be hiding it from their parents for their own safety. The rights of undocumented immigrants are at issue in the next referendum, LR 121. An act denying certain state services to illegal aliens.
We don't have a big problem with that in Montana.
Still, though, he says it's the principle of it.
If you're not paying your taxes, if you're not a resident of our country, of our state, then you shouldn't have access to the benefits that we all pay into.
The measure requires people seeking these services prove their citizenship. If they can't, they must submit to a federal database search.
The state of Montana will be paying the federal government to do its own job, which is to enforce federal immigration laws.
LR 121 would not allow illegal aliens to work for state government or receive a permit to practice a trade or profession. It also denies services for the physically disabled or those who are victims of crimes, which Hawk Houserath believes is just wrong.
I think that the average Montanan would say that all victims of crime, regardless of immigration status, should be able to access certain services to be able to seek redress for the crimes they've been a victim of.
And finally, LR 122. It's an act prohibiting the state or federal government from mandating the purchase of health insurance coverage or imposing penalties for decisions related to the purchase of health insurance coverage. Does this ring any bells? It should. It's arguably the most controversial element of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. There's a hitch with this one.
It has really no impact whatsoever.
Or at least no legal authority. See, LR 122 was drafted before the U.S. Supreme Court issued its ruling on the Affordable Care Act. That June ruling declared the U.S. Constitution does allow the federal government to mandate the purchase of health insurance coverage, so LR 122 is effectively a statement from the people.
States should have certain rights, and when we see those being encroached upon, we do need to push back.
Helena Democratic State Senator Christine Kaufman does support the Affordable Care Act, so she wouldn't want to make that statement. But she says this kind of gesture is pointless anyway.
It's an exercise in futility. Why should we expend all of this sort of emotional energy around saying, get out of the way, federal government, we'll handle it ourselves, when we've never been able to handle health care ourselves, and when it's going to be a meaningless solution.
Meaningless. You may remember Senator Lewis describing Initiative 166 that way.
It seems like such a waste of time and effort to put it on the ballot.
Yet he thinks the untenable statement behind LR 122 is worth making.
That's direction from the voters that the state of Montana can follow. It accomplishes something which is different than I-166.
Again, LR 122 would be unconstitutional the second it passed. That's the point Senator Kaufman is making, but it's important to note Kaufman does support the statement made in I-166.
To have the ability for private citizens, voters, to put together their own effort, organize their own effort when perhaps their leaders let them down. And once something's on the ballot, that's a very powerful tool.
We have used this ability of initiative over and over again in the last century. Dozens and dozens of initiatives have appeared on the ballot. About half of them pass. And certainly not everyone thinks those that have passed have been good for the state. With all the work that goes into putting these measures up to a vote, the politics, the controversy, the passion, the most important component is the citizenry being informed about them.
It is with this ballot measure process we, the people of Montana, are most directly responsible. We are the ones to blame for our missteps, the ones to congratulate for our successes. To learn more about these measures, visit the website montanapublicmedia.org. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you at the polls.